Mike Chen had spent 15 years turning his three-car garage into the ultimate home workshop and storage space, a private sanctuary where he restored classic cars and stored his prized collection of automotive memorabilia. That was until his homeowners association inexplicably declared it community storage and changed the locks, leaving him standing outside his own property like a stranger in his driveway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whole nightmare started back in spring 2024, when Mike finally finished transforming what was once a basic suburban garage into something truly special. After moving into the Highland Meadows subdivision with his wife Sarah in 2009, he'd gradually converted the spacious three-car garage into a car enthusiast's dream. The left bay housed his ongoing restoration project, a 1967 Mustang that he'd been methodically bringing back to life. The middle bay served as his immaculate workshop, with professional-grade tools mounted on custom pegboards and specialized equipment he'd collected over the years. The right bay was his pride and joy, a climate-controlled space showcasing vintage automotive signs, rare parts, and the kind of memorabilia that made other car enthusiasts' jaws drop. Unlike many of his neighbors who used their garages as cluttered storage dumps, Mike kept his space pristine. The epoxy floors gleamed under LED lighting he'd installed himself. Custom cabinets lined the walls, each containing carefully organized tools and parts. He'd even installed a sophisticated security system with cameras and automated doors, protecting what had become not just a hobby space, but a significant investment. His garage had become somewhat famous in the local car community. On weekends, other enthusiasts would stop by to admire his setup and seek advice on their own projects. Mike was always happy to help, sharing his knowledge about restoration techniques or the stories behind his collected pieces. He'd even started a small YouTube channel documenting his Mustang's restoration, which was steadily gaining followers. The Highland Meadows HOA had never been particularly easy to deal with. They were strict about everything from grass height to holiday decorations. But they'd never given Mike any serious trouble about his garage. He'd obtained all the proper permits for his renovations, kept the exterior looking pristine, and made sure his hobby never disturbed the neighbors. If anything, his property helped maintain high standards in the neighborhood, with several real estate agents pointing to his house as an example of well-maintained homes in the area. That's why the first sign of trouble caught him completely off guard. It was a warm April morning when Mike walked out to his garage, coffee in hand, ready to spend his Saturday working on the Mustang. But something stopped him in his tracks. There, hanging on his garage door, was an official-looking notice from the HOA. At first, he assumed it was another routine announcement about community guidelines or upcoming meetings. Instead, what he read made him nearly drop his coffee mug. Notice of Community Storage Space Designation, the header read in bold letters. Below it, in coldly official language, the document declared that his garage had been selected as a shared storage facility for Highland Meadows residents, citing some obscure bylaw about optimal utilization of neighborhood resources. Mike read the notice 3 times, convinced he must be misunderstanding something. How could they possibly declare his private garage, filled with thousands of dollars worth of tools and collectibles, a community storage space? It had to be some kind of mistake. He immediately pulled out his phone to call Sarah, who was visiting her sister for the weekend. "You won't believe what I'm looking at," he said when she answered, his voice a mix of disbelief and growing anger. As he read her the notice, he could hear her own shock through the phone. "That's ridiculous," Sarah said. "They can't just decide to take over your garage. We need to call the HOA office right away." Mike agreed, but as he would soon discover, this bizarre notice was just the beginning of what would become a months-long battle to protect his property from an increasingly aggressive homeowners association and its enigmatic new president. Victoria Blackwood. Mike spent the rest of Saturday morning trying to reach someone at the HOA office, but being the weekend, all his calls went straight to voicemail. He took photos of the notice and emailed them to the HOA's official address, marking it as urgent. The waiting was excruciating. Every time he looked at his garage, he felt a mix of anger and anxiety bubbling up inside him. Finally, Monday morning arrived, and Mike had barely slept. He'd taken the day off work, determined to get this sorted out. At precisely 9 a.m., when the HOA office opened, he was already parked outside the small building tucked between a coffee shop and a real estate office in the Highland Meadows shopping plaza. The office looked different than he remembered from his last visit years ago. The walls had been repainted in a stark grey, and new modern furniture filled the waiting area. Behind the desk sat a young woman who barely glanced up from her computer screen when Mike approached. "I need to speak with someone about this immediately," Mike said, placing the notice on the counter. "There's clearly been a mistake." The receptionist picked up the paper, scanned it briefly, and typed something into her computer. "No mistake. Mr. Chen, this is part of the new Community Resource Optimization Initiative. Ms. Blackwood will be happy to discuss the details with you, but she's in meetings all morning. I can schedule you for—" She paused, clicking through a calendar. "Thursday at 2 p.m. "Thursday? No, this needs to be addressed today," Mike insisted, his voice rising slightly. "Who is Ms. Blackwood? I thought Robert Martinez was the HOA president." "Victoria Blackwood took over as president last month," the receptionist replied, her tone remaining frustratingly neutral. "Mr. Martinez stepped down due to personal reasons, and I'm afraid Thursday is the earliest available appointment." Before Mike could protest further, his phone buzzed. A text message from his neighbor Tom made his stomach drop. "Mike, there are people measuring your driveway and taking photos of your garage. Everything okay?" Mike rushed out of the office, his questions still unanswered, and drove home as quickly as he safely could. When he arrived, he found two men in polo shirts with the HOA logo walking around his property. They carried tablets and measuring tools, acting as if they had every right to be there. "Excuse me," Mike called out as he got out of his car. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The taller of the two men, who wore thick-rimmed glasses and had a clipboard tucked under his arm, turned to face him. "Good morning, Mr. Chen. We're just conducting a preliminary assessment for the Community Resource Optimization Initiative. Standard procedure." "There's nothing standard about this," Mike replied, struggling to keep his voice level. "This is private property. I want you both off my driveway right now." The men exchanged glances before the one with glasses spoke again. "Sir, we have authorization from the board to conduct this assessment. If you have concerns, I suggest you take them. Up with Ms. Blackwood's office. We're just doing our job." Mike watched in frustrated disbelief as they finished their measurements and photos before finally leaving. He immediately went to inspect his garage, relieved to find that at least they hadn't tried to go inside. But something about their confident manner, the way they acted like this was all perfectly normal, sent a chill down his spine. That evening, after sharing the day's events with Sarah, Mike decided to do some research. He pulled out their HOA agreement, a thick document they'd signed when buying the house, and began going through it line by line. After hours of reading, he found nothing that gave the HOA the right to designate private garages as community storage. He also searched online for information about Victoria Blackwood, but found surprisingly little. She seemed to have appeared out of nowhere to take over the HOA presidency. The only recent mention he could find was a small notice in the community newsletter announcing the leadership change, with no explanation for Martinez's sudden departure. As Mike lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. The measured driveway, the cryptic notice, the mysterious new HOA president. None of it added up. He decided he couldn't wait until Thursday to get answers. First thing tomorrow, he would start reaching out to other homeowners in Highland Meadows. If this was really some new community initiative, surely he wasn't the only one affected. What he didn't know then was that his garage was just the first step in a plan that would soon throw the entire neighborhood into chaos, and Victoria Blackwood was far more than just an overzealous HOA president. The next morning, Mike started his investigation early. His first stop was Tom's house across the street. Tom had always been friendly and level-headed, the kind of neighbor who'd lend you his lawnmower without hesitation. When Mike showed him the notice, Tom's usual easygoing expression turned to concern. "That's bizarre," Tom said, studying the paper. "But now that you mention it, I saw something strange yesterday. Before those guys showed up to measure your driveway, there was a woman in a black SUV parked outside your house for at least a new hour. I assume she was a real estate agent or something." Mike felt his unease grow. What did she look like? Professional type, maybe mid-40s, dark hair, expensive-looking suit. She was taking notes on her phone the whole time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The description didn't match anyone Mike knew from the neighborhood. He spent the next few hours going door to door, talking to other neighbors about the situation. Most were shocked to hear about the notice, but a few responses caught his attention. The Hendersons, 3 houses down, mentioned receiving a community survey last week asking about garage space utilization. The Patels said someone from the HOA had been photographing all the garages on their street. And Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who'd lived in Highland Meadows for 20 years, dropped a real bombshell. "Oh, you haven't heard," she said, inviting Mike in for coffee. "They're doing the same thing to poor Dr. Williams over on Maple Drive, only his notice called it a community wellness storage facility because he's a doctor. He's furious about it." Mike immediately drove to Maple Drive. Dr. Williams' house was easy to spot. It was the only one with a 3-car garage like Mike's. The doctor was in his driveway when Mike arrived, and his face darkened when Mike mentioned the HOA notice. "They're trying to force me to store medical supplies for the neighborhood," Dr. Williams explained, his voice tight with anger. "Claims it's for emergency preparedness. I've already told them it's completely inappropriate and probably illegal, but they keep pushing. Yesterday, someone tried to deliver a pallet of first aid kits to my garage. I refused to accept it." His way home, Mike's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Honey, there's a package on our porch. Says it's from the HOA. Mike's heart raced as he sped home. The package turned out to be a large envelope containing what the HOA called a community storage space implementation guide. Inside was a detailed schedule for when neighbors could access his garage, a list of approved storage items, and, most disturbingly, a notice that the HOA would be upgrading his garage locks within the week to install a community access system. "They can't do this," Sarah said, reading over his shoulder. "We need to talk to a lawyer." Before Mike could respond, he noticed a group of people gathering near his driveway. As he watched, more neighbors approached, some carrying boxes and storage containers. A woman he'd never seen before was directing them, checking items off on a tablet. Mike stormed outside. "What's going on here?" The woman looked up, her professional smile never wavering. "Mr. Chen, perfect timing. I'm Amanda Porter, Community Resources Coordinator. We're just helping some residents prepare for the new storage arrangement. The implementation guide should have explained everything." "I don't care what the guide says," Mike replied, stepping between Amanda and his garage. "This is private property. You can't just decide to turn it into public storage." Mr. Chen, Amanda's voice took on a patronizing tone. This initiative has been approved by the board. Your cooperation would make things easier for everyone. We'd hate to see this escalate to a compliance issue. The threat in her words was clear. Mike turned to the gathered neighbors, some of whom looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, but you can't store your things here. This is my private garage, and I never agreed to this arrangement. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Amanda made a call. On her phone, Mike caught fragments of her conversation. He's being difficult. Yes, just like Williams. Might need to accelerate the timeline. That evening, Mike installed additional security cameras around his garage and added his own. Padlock to the main door. He knew these were temporary measures at best, but he needed time to figure out his next move. The HOA's aggressive push to take control of his garage seemed to be part of a larger plan, but what were they really after? As he reviewed the security camera footage from the past few days, he noticed something odd. The black SUV Tom had mentioned appeared in several clips, always parked just far enough away to avoid suspicion. In one frame, he caught a clear view of the driver, a well-dressed woman with dark hair who matched Tom's description. She appeared to be speaking into a phone, her expression intense and focused. Mike had a strong feeling he was looking at Victoria Blackwood, the mysterious new HOA president. But why was she personally surveilling his property? And what did she want with his garage? He would soon discover that the answer involved much more than just community storage space, and Victoria Blackwood's plans for Highland Meadows were far more ambitious and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The following morning, Mike woke up early to check on his garage. As he stepped outside, coffee in hand, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The padlock he'd installed was still in place, but the side door, the one he rarely used, was slightly ajar. His heart racing, he rushed over to investigate. The door hadn't been forced open. Someone had used a key. Inside, the changes made his blood run cold. Several large storage racks had been assembled along the back wall overnight, complete with labeled sections and numbered slots. A laminated sign hung prominently near the entrance. Highland Meadows Community Storage, Zone A. His carefully organized tool cabinet had been pushed aside to make room for the new installations. But what really set off alarm bells was the small electronic keypad mounted next to the side door. A sleek, modern device that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. Mike immediately tried his garage door opener, but nothing happened. They had already disabled the automatic door system. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling out his phone to call Sarah. Before he could dial, he heard footsteps behind him. "Good. Morning, Mr. Chen. I see you're admiring our improvements." Mike turned to find himself face to face with a tall, elegant woman in a charcoal grey suit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a name tag that read, Victoria Blackwood, HOA president. Despite the early hour, she looked impeccably put together, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "You had no right to do this," Mike said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "This is breaking and entering. I'm calling the police." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Chen. Everything we've done is perfectly legal under the community bylaws. Perhaps if you'd attended last month's emergency board meeting, you would understand the situation better." "What emergency meeting? Nobody told me about any meeting." "Notices were sent out electronically," she replied smoothly. "The board voted unanimously to implement the Community Resource Optimization Initiative. Your garage, given its size and location, was identified as an ideal starting point." Mike stepped closer, his anger building. "I never received any notice, and even if there was a meeting, you can't just take over someone's private property." "Actually, we can," Victoria produced a tablet from her briefcase. Section 47.3 of the updated HOA agreement gives the board emergency powers to requisition private facilities for community use during times of demonstrated need. The housing storage crisis in our area qualifies under that provision. Updated. Agreement. I never signed any update. Victoria's smile turned cold. The previous board, under Mr. Martinez, approved automatic acceptance of updates unless specifically opted out of. Again, this was all covered in last month's meeting. Before Mike could respond, a small moving truck pulled up outside. Two men in uniforms began unloading boxes and plastic storage containers. Perfect timing, Victoria said. These are the first. Community storage items. Mrs. Anderson from Oak Street is downsizing and needs temporary space for her late husband's belongings. She handed Mike a small key card. This will give you limited access to your garage during designated hours, which you'll find listed in the implementation guide. Limited access to my own garage? Mike was dumbfounded. Where am I supposed to work on my car? What about all my tools and collectibles? You have until Friday to remove any personal items, Victoria replied. After that, anything left will be considered donated to the community resource pool. She checked her watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other properties to inspect. As Victoria walked away, Mike noticed more neighbors arriving, carrying boxes and looking uncertainly between him and the moving truck. The two uniformed men had already begun loading items onto the new storage racks, treating his garage like a public warehouse. Mike retreated inside his house, his mind racing. He immediately called Dr. Williams, who answered on the first ring. They hit my garage, too, the doctor said grimly. Same setup, racks, keypad, everything. They're claiming it's for medical supply storage in my case. They must have done both garages overnight. Mike spent the next hour documenting everything with photos and video, his hands shaking with anger and disbelief. When he tried to access the HOA website to find information about the emergency meeting, he discovered his login no longer worked. Calls to the HOA office went straight to voicemail. By afternoon, his garage was half filled with strangers' belongings. The electronic keypad beeped regularly as people came and went, using keycards they must have received from the HOA. Mike watched helplessly as his private space was transformed into a public storage facility, piece by piece. That evening, as he and Sarah sat at their kitchen table surrounded by printouts of HOA documents and legal websites, they heard a commotion outside. Looking out the window, they saw Victoria Blackwood supervising the installation of a security camera on a pole near their driveway, pointed directly at the garage. They're monitoring us, Sarah whispered. This isn't just about storage space, Mike. Something bigger is going on here. Mike nodded grimly. We need help. Professional help. First thing tomorrow, we're finding a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes. Victoria Blackwood might think she has all the power, but she's about to learn that she picked the wrong garage to mess with. What Mike didn't realize was that by morning, the situation would escalate far beyond just a dispute over garage access, and Victoria Blackwood's true motivations would prove more sinister than anyone in Highland Meadows could have imagined. First, the Wednesday morning, Mike and Sarah headed to the offices of Anderson and Patel, a law firm specializing in property disputes. James Anderson, a seasoned attorney with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently as they described the situation. I have to admit, Anderson said, leaning back in his chair, this is one of the more aggressive HOA takeovers I've seen, and I've been handling HOA cases for 20 years. He picked up the implementation guide, frowning as he read. They're citing emergency powers under a bylaw update you never explicitly agreed to. That's right, Mike confirmed, and now they've completely taken over my garage. I can only access it during designated hours with a key card, like some kind of storage facility employee. Anderson's frown deepened as he reviewed the photos on Mike's phone. The overnight installation of storage equipment, the electronic access system, the surveillance camera, this is well organized and well funded, much more sophisticated than typical HOA overreach. Just then, Mike's phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Dude, you need to see this email from the HOA. Check your spam folder." Mike quickly pulled up his email. There in his spam folder was a message from the Highland Meadows HOA with the subject line, "Notice of violation, immediate action. Required." His hands shook slightly as he opened it. "Dear Mr. Chen," he read aloud, "this notice is to inform you that your property at 1542 Highland Drive is in violation of multiple community guidelines. Violations include unauthorized modification of community storage facilities, interference with approved storage operations, and failure to comply with the Community Resource Optimization Initiative. Fines of $200 per day will be assessed until these violations are resolved. They're trying to fine me for protecting my own property." Mike's voice rose in disbelief. Anderson held out his hand for the phone, quickly scanning the email. "This is a pressure tactic. They're hoping the threat of mounting fines will force you to comply." He turned to his computer and began typing. "Let me show you something interesting." After a few minutes of searching public records, he turned the monitor toward Mike and Sarah. "Victoria Blackwood. Before becoming your HOA president, she worked for a company called Urban Development Solutions. They're known for acquiring residential properties through various means, some more ethical than others, and converting them into commercial developments." Sarah leaned forward. "Are you saying this isn't really about community storage?" "I suspect. The storage program is just a pretext," Anderson replied, "a way to establish control over key properties. Your 3-car garage, Dr. Williams's garage. They're targeting the largest private structures in the neighborhood. But why?" He turned back to his computer, pulling up a map. "Let's see what else is happening in your area." As they studied the map, Mike's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the Highland Meadows HOA account, but the sender was labeled as Community Compliance Committee. "Notice of emergency board meeting," Mike read. "All residents are required to attend tonight's meeting at 7 p.m. in the community center. Agenda items include ratification of recent community storage initiatives, approval of increased compliance enforcement measures, and discussion of property maintenance standards." "Required to attend?" Sarah asked. "Can they do that?" Anderson shook his head. "They're escalating. This meeting is probably meant to intimidate residents and push through more aggressive measures." He pulled out a legal pad. "I'm coming with you to this meeting, but first, we need to prepare." Over the next few hours, Anderson helped them document everything and develop a strategy. As they worked, more disturbing information emerged. Other residents had received similar violation notices. The HOA website had been completely redesigned, with new sections about community resource sharing and optimization initiatives. Most troubling was a proposed amendment that would give the board broad powers to repurpose private structures for community use. At 6:45 p.m., Mike and Sarah arrived at the community center with Anderson. The parking lot was packed, and they could feel the tension in the air. Inside, the usually spacious meeting room was cramped with folding chairs arranged in tight rows. A long table had been set up at the front, with Victoria Blackwood seated. In the center, flanked by several unfamiliar faces. "Those aren't regular board members," Sarah whispered, scanning the table. "I don't recognize any of them except Victoria." Before Mike could respond, Victoria stood and called the meeting to order. Her voice carried easily through the room, confident and authoritative. "Good evening, residents of Highland Meadows. Tonight marks an important step forward in our community's evolution. The initiatives we've begun implementing are just the beginning of a comprehensive neighborhood improvement plan." She gestured to a screen behind her, where a sleek presentation began playing. Images of modernized storage facilities, community spaces, and what looked like commercial developments flashed by. Highland Meadows has been selected for a pilot program that will revolutionize how suburban communities utilize private space for public benefit. Mike felt Anderson tense beside him. The lawyer was scribbling rapidly in his notebook, his expression grave. Something about the presentation, about Victoria's careful choice of words, seemed to concern him deeply. As Victoria continued outlining her vision for Highland Meadows, Mike realized with growing dread that his garage was just the first piece in a much larger puzzle. This wasn't just about storage space or property rights anymore. It was about the future of their entire community. And Victoria Blackwood's plans were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The real question was, how far would she go to see those plans through, and what would it cost the residents of Highland Meadows to stop her? The emergency board meeting quickly devolved into chaos. As Victoria Blackwood detailed more community optimization plans, residents began shouting questions and objections. Mike watched as she skillfully deflected each concern with corporate doublespeak about shared resources and community benefits. "What about our rights as property owners?" someone called out from the back. Victoria's practiced smile never wavered. Under the updated bylaws, the board has broad authority to implement measures that benefit the community as a whole. Your individual property rights must be balanced against collective needs. That's when Dr. Williams stood up, his face red with anger. "This is nonsense. You've turned my garage into some kind of makeshift medical storage facility without my consent. I'm a retired physician. Do you have any idea of the liability issues involved?" "Dr. Williams," Victoria replied smoothly, "the community wellness storage program was specifically designed with your expertise in mind. Think of the benefit to our residents having emergency medical supplies readily available." Mike had heard enough. He stood up, Anderson rising beside him. "Ms. Blackwood, I'd like to introduce my attorney, James Anderson. He has some questions about these updated bylaws you keep referencing." Victoria's smile flickered slightly. "Legal concerns can be addressed during regular business hours through proper channels. This meeting is for discussing implementation, not debating established policies." Anderson stepped forward anyway. "My client never received proper notice of these changes. In fact, most residents here seem unaware of any bylaw updates. Can you provide documentation showing when and how these changes were approved?" Before Victoria could respond, one of the unfamiliar board members, a man in an expensive suit, whispered something in her ear. She nodded slightly before addressing the crowd again. "Due to time constraints, we'll need to table individual concerns. For now, let's move on to voting on the new compliance measures." "Voting?" Sarah stood up. "Half the homeowners aren't even here. You can't hold a valid vote without proper notice and quorum." Victoria's expression hardened. "The emergency measures clause allows for expedited voting procedures. Those present may vote on behalf of the community." The room erupted in protests. Through the commotion, Mike noticed Amanda Porter, the community resources coordinator, recording something on her tablet. She was methodically photographing everyone who spoke up against the board's plans. Suddenly, the lights in the community center flickered, then went out completely. In the darkness, Mike heard shuffling and muffled conversations. When emergency lights came on a moment later, Victoria and the new board members were already heading for the exit. "Due to technical difficulties, this meeting will be continued at a later date," Victoria announced over her shoulder. "All proposed measures are considered provisionally approved, pending final ratification. Check your email for updates." As confused residents filed out of the building, Anderson pulled Mike and Sarah aside. "This was a setup," he said quietly. They never intended to have a real discussion. This meeting was about identifying opposition and creating the appearance of procedural compliance. But they can't just declare their measures provisionally approved, can they? Sarah asked. Anderson shook his head. It's legally questionable, but they're moving fast and counting on confusion and intimidation to prevent organized resistance. We need to act quickly. Outside, Mike noticed the black SUV pulling away from the community center. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Victoria in the passenger seat, speaking intently into her phone. The man who had whispered to her during the meeting was driving. The next morning, residents woke up to find their email inboxes flooded with official-looking HOA notices. The messages detailed new community optimization policies and included forms for requesting access to the shared storage network. Most disturbing was a schedule for property assessment visits. Apparently, teams would be evaluating more garages and storage spaces throughout Highland Meadows for community repurposing. Mike's phone started ringing early. Other homeowners, scared and confused, wanted to know what to do. Some had already received visits from Amanda Porter and her team, pressure to sign authorization forms for garage modifications. "Don't sign anything," Mike advised each caller. "We're getting legal help. Stay strong." But as the day progressed, he learned that several residents had already given in. The Hendersons signed over partial access to their garage after being threatened with thousands in fines. The Patels agreed to storage space sharing when Amanda suggested their home business license might be in jeopardy if they didn't comply. By evening, Highland Meadows felt like a community under siege. More surveillance cameras had appeared on street corners. Unknown vehicles patrolled the neighborhoods, their occupants taking photos and making notes. The HOA office, usually closed by 5 p.m., had lights on late into the night. Mike stood in his driveway, watching people he barely knew entering and exiting his garage with their key cards, storing their belongings in what used to be his private space. Each beep of the electronic lock felt like a personal insult. "This ends now," he told Sarah as they watched another car pull up to their garage. "Whatever Victoria Blackwood's real plan is, we're going to expose it. She picked the wrong neighborhood to mess with." What Mike didn't know was that Victoria had anticipated resistance, and she had already set in motion a plan that would make their fight much more difficult and much more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Early Thursday morning, Mike sat in Anderson's office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. The lawyer had spent the night researching similar cases and Highland Meadows' original HOA agreements. What he'd found was troubling. "Look at this," Anderson said, pointing to his computer screen. "I traced Victoria Blackwood's history with Urban Development Solutions. They've done this before, infiltrating HOA boards, pushing through questionable bylaw changes, then using those changes to force property transfers." Property transfers. Mike leaned forward to look at the articles Anderson had pulled up. "You mean they're trying to take people's homes?" "Not directly. Their usual pattern is to start with auxiliary structures, garages, storage sheds, pool houses. They create hardships for homeowners through fines and restrictions, then offer to solve the problem by purchasing the properties at below-market rates." Sarah, who had taken the morning off work to join them, shook her head in disbelief. "But why target Highland Meadows? It's just a regular suburban neighborhood." Anderson pulled up a map on his second monitor. "Look at the surrounding area. There's that new tech corridor being developed 2 miles east, the planned light rail extension to the north, and 3 major retail developments within a 5-mile radius. Highland Meadows sits right in the middle of it all. Prime real estate," Mike muttered, the pieces starting to fall into place. "So this community storage nonsense is just the first step?" "Exactly. They're testing the waters, seeing how much resistance they'll face. The garages are just the beginning. If they succeed with this, they'll likely move on to more aggressive measures." As if on cue, Mike's phone buzzed with a new email from the HOA. The subject line made his blood run cold. Notice of property inspection and compliance review, 48-hour warning. "They're not wasting any time," he said, showing the email to Anderson. "They want to inspect our entire property, not just the garage. Says it's mandatory under the new guidelines." Anderson read the notice carefully, his frown deepening. "This is aggressive even for them. They're trying to establish a pattern of authority over your entire property." He turned to his desk phone and dialed a number. "Let me get my colleague. Involved. She specializes in real estate law and has fought urban development solutions before." While Anderson made his call, Mike and Sarah reviewed security camera footage from their garage on Mike's laptop. The stream of people coming and going had increased, and not all of them appeared to be Highland Meadows residents. Some arrived in commercial vehicles, unloading what looked like business inventory rather than personal storage. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to one clip from the previous night. A group of men in unmarked uniforms had spent nearly an hour installing additional shelving and what appeared to be electrical equipment. "They're treating it like they own it already." Anderson finished his call and rejoined them. "My colleague, Linda Martinez, can meet us tomorrow. She's handled 3 cases involving urban development solutions and knows their playbook. In the meantime, we need to document everything." They spent the next 2 hours creating a detailed timeline of events, from the first notice to the previous night's mysterious installations. Anderson was particularly interested in the emergency board meeting and the suspicious power outage. "We need to prove these weren't legitimate board actions," he explained. "I've requested copies of all HOA bylaws and meeting minutes from the past year. They're legally required to provide them, though I expect they'll try to stall." As they worked, Mike's phone kept buzzing with messages from neighbors. The Hendersons reported that their garage had been fitted with the same electronic access system overnight. The Patels were being pressured to convert their garage into a community business center, and Dr. Williams had received a cease and desist letter demanding he stop interfering with medical supply operations. "They're moving faster than I expected," Anderson admitted, reviewing the messages. "Usually, these operations take months to implement. Victoria must have a reason for rushing things." Sarah pulled up the Highland Meadows community website on her tablet. "Look at this! They've completely revised the site. There's a whole section about Phase 1 of community optimization with architectural renderings of some kind of commercial complex." Mike leaned over to look. The renderings showed modern buildings with glass facades, nothing like their current suburban neighborhood. In one corner of the image, he noticed something that made his heart skip. The location was marked as former Highland Meadows community. "Former," Sarah whispered. "They're planning to eliminate the entire neighborhood." Anderson quickly photographed the web page. "This is good. They're showing their hand. But we need to move fast. Linda and I can file for an emergency injunction, but we need more evidence of their methods." "I think I know where to start," Mike said, pulling up his garage's security camera feed. "These late-night installations, if we can prove they're doing unauthorized modifications to private property." "Good thinking," Anderson nodded. "Keep your cameras running. Document everything. And whatever you do, don't sign anything they send you, no matter what threats they make." As they left Anderson's office, Mike felt both more worried and more determined than ever. Victoria Blackwood and Urban Development Solutions had clearly picked Highland Meadows as their next target, but they hadn't counted on facing organized resistance. What they didn't know was that their rushed timeline and aggressive tactics were about to backfire spectacularly, thanks to one homeowner who refused to give up his garage without a fight. That evening, Mike installed additional security cameras around his property, making sure to cover all angles of the garage and driveway. He'd barely finished when his phone lit up with a call from Dr. Williams. "Mike, you need to see this." The doctor's voice was tense. I just got copies of some documents from a friend who works at City Hall. Remember how Victoria claimed the storage program was approved by local authorities? It's all fake. The permits they're showing everyone are forgeries. Mike's pulse quickened. Can you prove it? Better than that. My friend made copies before anyone could make them disappear. I'm on my way to you now. As Mike waited for Dr. Williams to arrive, he noticed a familiar black SUV cruising slowly past his house. This time, there were two people inside. Victoria, in the passenger seat, and a man he didn't recognize driving. They made no attempt to hide their surveillance, Victoria openly taking photos with her phone as they passed. Minutes later, Dr. Williams pulled into Mike's driveway. But before he could get out of his car, another vehicle, a white sedan, blocked him in. Amanda Porter stepped out, clutching her ever-present tablet. "Dr. Williams," she called out, her voice carrying across the driveway. "The board needs to discuss some concerns about your recent activities. Ms. Blackwood has requested an immediate meeting." Mike stepped outside, recording everything on his phone. "He's not going anywhere with you." Amanda's professional smile didn't waver. "This is a private HOA matter, Mr. Chen. Your interference could result in additional violations being added to your record." Dr. Williams emerged from his car, a thick envelope clutched in his hand. "I have nothing to discuss with the board. Now please move your car." Instead of complying, Amanda tapped something on her tablet. Moments later, the black SUV reappeared, pulling up alongside the white sedan. Victoria stepped out, followed by the unknown man who now wore a security uniform. "Doctor, we can discuss this civilly," Victoria said, her tone smooth but threatening, "or we can escalate matters. Your choice." Mike moved closer to Dr. Williams, still recording. "This is harassment. You can't intimidate people in their own driveways." Actually, under the new bylaws, HOA security has full access to all common areas, including driveways, Victoria replied. "Now, Dr. Williams, about those documents you removed from City Hall." "I didn't remove anything," Dr. Williams snapped. "These are copies, legally obtained, public records." The security guard took a step forward, but Mike moved to block his path. "Back off. You're on camera, and our lawyer would love to see you try something." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Recording HOA officials without consent is a violation of—" "Save it," Mike interrupted. "We both know your bylaws are as fake as your permits. Now get off my property before I call the police." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Victoria gave a slight nod, and Amanda and the security guard retreated to their vehicles. Before getting back in the SUV, Victoria turned to face Mike and Dr. Williams. "This could have been handled professionally," she said, her voice cold. "Remember that when things get difficult." After they left, Dr. Williams handed Mike the envelope with shaking hands. "They're getting desperate. These documents prove they've been falsifying official approvals. But that's not all. Look at this." Inside the envelope was a series of emails between Victoria and Urban Development Solutions, discussing something called Project Transformation. The emails mentioned Highland Meadows specifically, referring to the community storage program. As phase one of a larger plan, they're planning to force everyone out, Dr. Williams explained. The storage program, the fines, the restrictions, it's all designed to make life so difficult that people will sell. Mike was about to respond when his phone buzzed with an alert from his security system. The camera feed showed several people entering his garage, using key cards to access the new electronic lock. But these weren't neighbors storing personal items. They were workers in uniforms, carrying what looked like construction equipment. "What are they doing now?" Dr. Williams asked, peering at Mike's phone. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Mike started toward the garage, but Dr. Williams grabbed his arm. "Wait," the doctor said, pointing down the street. The black SUV was still there, parked just far enough away to maintain surveillance. "They're watching, waiting for us to interfere. That's probably why they tried to stop me from giving you these documents. They want us to react." Mike realized he was right. This was a trap. Victoria was trying to provoke them into doing something that would justify more severe measures. Instead of confronting the workers, he called Anderson and sent him the security footage in real time. "Document everything," the lawyer advised. "This is actually helping our case. Every unauthorized modification they make is more evidence of their overreach." As night fell, Mike and Dr. Williams watched helplessly as the workers continued their mysterious installations in the garage. The black SUV maintained its vigilant position, a constant reminder that they were being monitored. "They think they're wearing us down," Mike said quietly, "but they don't realize. Every move they make is just giving us more ammunition." What Victoria and her team didn't know was that their aggressive surveillance had just handed Mike and his allies exactly what they needed: proof of a coordinated campaign of intimidation that would soon come back to haunt them. Friday morning brought a new level of escalation. Mike woke to find his driveway blocked by 3 large delivery trucks. Workers in Urban Development Solutions uniforms were unloading industrial storage units and electronic equipment, all headed for his garage. He immediately called Anderson, who answered on the first ring. "I was just about to call you," the lawyer said. "Linda's found something big. We need you at the office right away. And bring Dr. Williams if you can. Those documents he got are crucial." "I can't even get out of my driveway," Mike replied, watching another truck arrive. "They've got me blocked in." "Perfect. Get photos. This is exactly the kind of harassment we need to document. I'll send someone to pick you up." 20 minutes later, a silver Tesla pulled up at the curb. Linda Martinez stepped out, a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s with an air of quiet authority. The workers barely glanced at her as she walked up to Mike's front door. "James sent me," she said when Mike answered. "Let them keep blocking your driveway. Every minute they do is another violation we can add to our filing." As they prepared to leave, Victoria's black SUV appeared, parking directly behind Linda's Tesla. Victoria emerged, followed by 2 men in business suits whom Mike had never seen before. "Mr. Chen," Victoria called out, her heels clicking on the pavement as she approached. "I'm glad I caught you. We need to discuss some concerning developments." Linda stepped forward, positioning herself between Mike and Victoria. "I'm Linda Martinez, Mr. Chen's legal counsel. Any discussions can go through me." Victoria's practiced smile didn't waver. "Of course. I recognize your name, Ms. Martinez. Still fighting lost causes, I see." She turned to the men beside her. "These are Mr. Harrison and Mr. Peters from Urban Development Solutions. They have a proposition that might interest Mr. Chen." The taller of the 2 men, Harrison, opened a leather portfolio. "We've been monitoring the situation here in Highland Meadows, Mr. Chen. It seems there's been some friction regarding the community optimization program. We'd like to offer a solution. The only solution is to return full control of my garage to me," Mike replied firmly. "Actually," Harrison continued, "we're prepared to offer you fair market value for your entire property. A clean break, no more conflicts with the HOA. You could relocate to a more compatible community." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Are you admitting that Urban Development Solutions is behind the HOA's actions? We're merely offering to resolve an unfortunate situation," Peters spoke up, his voice smooth as oil. "The community is changing, Mr. Chen. Progress is inevitable. You can either profit from it or what?" Mike challenged. Victoria stepped forward. "Or face mounting fines, legal fees, and increasing restrictions. The board has broad powers under the new bylaws. Fighting us will be expensive and ultimately futile." Linda pulled out her phone and pressed record. "Please repeat that threat. Ms. Blackwood, it would be very helpful for our case." Victoria's smile finally faltered. She signaled to Harrison and Peters, and they retreated to the SUV. Before following them, she turned back to Mike. "Consider the offer carefully," she said. It expires at noon. After that, things will become much more difficult. After they left, Linda turned to Mike. They're scared. That whole show was about trying to buy you off before we can expose what they're doing. What exactly are they doing? Mike asked as they got into her Tesla. What did you find? Not here, Linda said quietly, gesturing toward the surveillance cameras that now dotted the neighborhood. Let's get to the office. James is gathering everyone who's willing to fight back. It's time to show Victoria Blackwood that she picked the wrong community to target. At Anderson's office, they found Dr. Williams already there, along with several other Highland Meadows residents. The conference room walls were covered with documents, photos, and diagrams. The community storage program is just a cover, Anderson explained once everyone was seated. Urban Development Solutions has been acquiring properties around Highland Meadows for months, using shell companies to hide their activities. They're planning a massive commercial development, but they need the entire neighborhood. The garage takeovers are designed to make life difficult enough that people will sell, Linda added. They've done this before in other communities, but they usually move slowly, carefully. This time they're rushing, making mistakes. Like these permits, Dr. Williams held up his documents. They didn't even bother to forge them properly. The signatures don't match. The dates are inconsistent. Mike studied the conference room walls, taking in the evidence of the conspiracy against their neighborhood. So what's our next move? Linda smiled grimly. We file for an emergency injunction this afternoon, but more importantly, we go public. Victoria and her friends at Urban Development Solutions are counting on keeping this quiet. Time to make some noise. As they planned their counterattack, Mike's phone buzzed with alerts from his home security system. The workers were installing something new in his garage, what looked like network servers and additional surveillance equipment. Let them keep going, Linda advised, seeing his concern. Every unauthorized modification is more evidence in our favor. They think they're wearing us down, but they're actually building our case for us. What Victoria and Urban Development Solutions didn't realize was that their aggressive timeline and heavy-handed tactics were about to backfire spectacularly. The community they thought would fold under pressure was instead coming together to fight back. The rest of Friday morning was spent poring over documents and building their case. Linda's research had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Urban Development Solutions had been systematically targeting residential areas near growing commercial zones, using various tactics to force homeowners out. Look at this, Linda said, spreading out a series of maps on Anderson's conference table. These red dots show properties they've acquired in the last 2 years. Notice anything? Mike studied the pattern. The acquisitions formed a rough circle around Highland Meadows, like a noose slowly tightening. They've been surrounding us. Exactly, Anderson confirmed. They buy up surrounding properties, then pressure the remaining homeowners to sell. The HOA infiltration is their newest tactic, but the end goal is always the same: total property control. Dr. Williams was examining property records on his laptop. Victoria Blackwood's name keeps coming up in interesting places. She's listed as a director for at least 6 different shell companies, all connected to Urban Development Solutions. And here's where it gets really interesting, Linda added, pulling up a document on the projector screen. These are plans filed with the City Planning Commission 3 months ago. They're purposely vague, but look at the proposed development zone. The map showed a massive commercial complex, office towers, retail spaces and parking structures, overlaid perfectly on top of Highland Meadows. The project name caught Mike's eye: Highland Innovation District. They're planning to erase our entire neighborhood, he said quietly. Just then, Mike's phone buzzed with multiple messages. The first was from Sarah. Emergency HOA email just went out. They're calling another meeting for tonight. Mandatory attendance. The second message was from Tom. Mike, there are people in suits measuring my garage now. They won't leave when I tell them to. The third was from the Hendersons. HOA security just delivered some kind of equipment to our garage, said we have to install it by tomorrow or face fines. They're accelerating their timeline, Linda observed, reading the messages over Mike's shoulder. Something spooked them. Anderson picked up his phone. I'll have the emergency injunction filing ready within the hour, but we need to be smart about this meeting tonight. They're probably planning something big. I think I know what it is, Dr. Williams said, turning his laptop around. On the screen was an email he'd recovered from the City Hall documents, a communication between Victoria and Urban Development Solutions Corporate Office. Phase 1, Community Storage Initiative, proceeding ahead of schedule. Resident resistance, lower than anticipated. Recommend accelerating to Phase 2, full property acquisition. Target date for mass purchase offers, end of month. Those who refuse initial offers will face escalating pressure through HOA mechanisms until compliance is achieved. The storage program was never meant to last, Linda explained. It's just a way to establish control and create hardship. The real plan is to force everyone to sell at below market rates. Mike's phone buzzed again. Another alert from his home security system. The camera feed showed more workers in his garage, but these weren't installing storage equipment. They were removing his tools and personal items, loading them into a truck. I can't do that, he exclaimed, jumping up. Those are my belongings. Actually, this helps us, Linda said, quickly typing on her laptop. They've just crossed a major legal line. Unauthorized removal of personal property. That's theft, plain and simple. James, call your contact at the police department. As Anderson made the call, Mike received another message, this one directly from Victoria Blackwood. Mr. Chen, in light of your continued non-compliance, the board has authorized the removal of unauthorized personal items from the community storage facility. You may reclaim your belongings at the HOA office during normal business hours after paying outstanding fines and storage fees. She's trying to force my hand, Mike realized. Make me come to them, play by their rules. Which is exactly what we're not going to do, Linda said firmly. The meeting tonight, that's where they'll make their big move. They'll probably present the purchase offers, try to pressure people into signing on the spot. So, what's our counter-move? Mike asked. Linda smiled grimly. We're going to beat them to the punch. I've already contacted several news outlets. They'll be at the meeting tonight. Victoria thinks she can operate in the shadows. Let's see how her plans hold up under the spotlight. As they finalized their strategy for the evening, Mike couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and determination. The scope of Urban Development Solutions' plan was staggering. They weren't just after his garage or even his house. They wanted to erase an entire community. But Victoria Blackwood had made a crucial mistake. In her rush to push through her company's agenda, she'd united the very community she was trying to destroy. And now, with solid evidence of their schemes and legal help on their side, the residents of Highland Meadows were ready to fight back. The question was, how far would Victoria and Urban Development Solutions go to stop them from exposing the truth at tonight's meeting? By late afternoon, Highland Meadows was buzzing with tension. Word had spread about the mandatory meeting, and residents were sharing stories of similar garage intrusions and equipment installations. Mike and Linda had returned to his house to gather more evidence, only to find the situation had deteriorated further. His garage had been completely transformed. The workers had removed nearly everything personal, replacing his tools and collectibles with industrial storage units and electronic equipment. A new sign hung prominently, Highland Meadows Community Storage Hub Alpha, authorized personnel. Only, they've actually installed network servers, Linda observed, examining the new equipment. This is way beyond simple storage. They're setting up some kind of distribution center. Mike's attention was drawn to a small, blinking device mounted near the ceiling. That's new. Wasn't here this morning. Linda took several photos, then pulled out a small electronic detector from her briefcase. As she swept it around the garage, it began beeping rapidly near the new device. It's a signal repeater, probably for extending their surveillance network. But there's something else. She moved the detector methodically around the space. The beeping intensified near several spots. They've planted bugs, audio surveillance devices. This is completely illegal. Before they could investigate further, Mike's phone rang. It was Sarah. "Honey, you need to get home right now. Victoria's here with some kind of official-looking team. They're saying they need to inspect the house itself now, not just the garage." Mike and Linda rushed back to find 3 vehicles parked in his driveway. Victoria's black SUV and 2 white vans marked Community Compliance Team. Victoria stood, with several men in uniforms holding what appeared to be inspection equipment. "Mr. Chen," Victoria called out as they approached. "As per Section 7.3 of the updated bylaws, we're conducting a comprehensive property assessment. Please provide immediate access to all areas of your home." Linda stepped forward, phone recording. "My client does not consent to any inspection. You have no legal authority to enter his home." "Actually," Victoria produced a document, "the board has authorized emergency access under the community safety provision. If you attempt to obstruct official HOA business, will be forced to take more severe measures." "What kind of measures?" Mike demanded. Victoria smiled coldly. "Immediate financial penalties, service disconnection, and possible legal action for breach of HOA regulations. Do you really want to risk that?" While they argued, Mike noticed one of the uniformed men quietly moving toward the side of the house. He was carrying something that looked suspiciously like lockpicking tools. "Linda," Mike whispered, nodding toward the man. "I see him," she replied, softly, then raised her voice. "Victoria, your team member is attempting to gain unauthorized access to my client's home. That's breaking and entering. I'm calling the police." The man quickly retreated, but Victoria remained unruffled. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. We're simply conducting routine safety inspections, as required by—" She was interrupted by a commotion from the garage. Another team member emerged, holding what appeared to be a small electronic device. "Ma'am, we found it, just like you said." Victoria's expression shifted to one of triumph. "As I suspected. Mr. Chen, can you explain why there's an illegal signal jammer in your garage? That's a serious violation of HOA security protocols." "What?" Mike started toward the garage, but 2 uniformed men blocked his path. "I've never seen that device before." "They planted it," Linda said firmly, still recording everything. "Just like they planted the surveillance devices we found earlier. This is a setup." Victoria signaled to her team, "Document everything. This will need to be included in tonight's meeting agenda." She turned to Mike. "The board takes security violations very seriously, Mr. Chen. I suggest you attend tonight's meeting with a cooperative attitude. Your continued residence in Highland Meadows may depend on it." After Victoria and her team left, Linda immediately called Anderson. "They're planting evidence now, trying to create pretexts for more aggressive action, and they attempted to force entry into his house." "This is actually perfect," Anderson replied. "They're getting sloppy, making mistakes. Keep recording everything. The more illegal actions we can document, the stronger our case becomes." Mike stood in his driveway, watching one of Victoria's vehicles maintain position at the end of the street. "They're not even trying to hide their surveillance anymore, because they think they're about to win," Linda explained. "Tonight's meeting isn't just about purchase offers. They're planning to use these manufactured violations to justify immediate action against anyone who refuses to sell." "Then we need to be ready," Mike said, determination hardening his voice. "If they want to play dirty, they're about to learn they picked the wrong people to mess with." As evening approached, Mike and Linda prepared for the confrontation to come. What Victoria and her team didn't realize was that their increasingly desperate tactics had just given Mike and his allies exactly the evidence they needed to expose. The truth behind urban development solutions plans. The real question was, what would Victoria do when she realized her carefully constructed scheme was about to come crashing down? 11. The community center was packed by 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes. Before the mandatory meeting was set to begin, Mike, Linda, and Anderson positioned themselves near the back, waiting for their moment. Dr. Williams had helped spread the word, and several residents had brought their own recording devices. Victoria took her place at the podium precisely at 7 p.m., flanked by her new board members and 2 security guards. The screen behind her displayed a professionally designed presentation titled Highland Meadows, A Vision for the Future. Before we begin tonight's agenda, Victoria announced, her voice carrying through the room, we need to address some serious security concerns. She gestured to one of her assistants, who began distributing packets to the audience. Several violations have been discovered during our routine community inspections. Mike opened his packet to find photos of the device allegedly found in his garage, along with a list of documented violations that he'd supposedly committed. The fines totaled over $15,000. These security breaches, Victoria continued, combined with ongoing resistance to community improvement initiatives, have forced the board to take extraordinary action, effective immediately, all non-compliant. Improprieties will be subject to enhanced oversight measures. Linda stood up. And what exactly does enhanced oversight mean, Ms. Blackwood? Victoria's smile tightened. For everyone's safety, we'll be installing additional security systems in all homes. Residents with outstanding violations will have restricted access to community amenities until their issues are resolved. The room erupted in protests. Several homeowners stood up, waving their violation notices and demanding explanations for seemingly random fines. This is illegal, someone shouted. You can't just install systems in our homes without permission. Actually, Victoria replied smoothly, under the emergency powers granted to the board, we can take any necessary steps to ensure community safety. Now moving on to our main agenda item. The screen behind her changed to show property valuations and purchase offers. Urban Development Solutions has generously offered to help resolve these ongoing conflicts. They're prepared to purchase all Highland Meadows properties at fair market value, allowing residents to relocate to more suitable communities. Mike noticed several men in suits moving to block the exits. Harrison and Peters, the Urban Development Solutions executives, took positions near the podium. Representatives are available tonight to process immediate sales, Victoria announced. Those who sign tonight will receive a 10% premium on their offer. Those who choose to delay, she paused meaningfully, will need to address their violations first, which may impact their property values. Linda stood again. Before anyone considers these offers, they should know that we've filed an emergency injunction against the HOA and Urban Development Solutions. We have evidence of multiple illegal activities, including unauthorized surveillance, property theft, and document forgery. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. That's a baseless accusation, is it? Anderson rose, holding up a folder. We have proof that Urban Development Solutions has been planning this takeover for months. The community storage program, the fake violations, the security installations. It's all part of a coordinated effort to force residents out. Before Victoria could respond, the doors burst open. Several news crews entered, cameras rolling. Mike recognized reporters from local stations. Linda's contacts had come through. Victoria's face darkened. This meeting is closed to the press. Security, remove them. The meeting is mandatory for all Highland Meadows residents, Linda countered. These reporters all bought homes in the community this morning. They're legally entitled to be here. Mike couldn't help but smile at Linda's clever move. They had discussed this strategy earlier, using Victoria's own rules against her. The room descended into chaos. Some residents were demanding to see the evidence Anderson mentioned. Others were confronting the Urban Development Solutions representatives about the purchase offers. Victoria tried repeatedly to restore order, but her authority was crumbling. "We have proof," Dr. Williams called out, standing on a chair to be heard. "They've been falsifying documents, planting evidence, trying to intimidate us into selling. It's all part of their plan to demolish Highland Meadows and build a commercial complex." The news cameras swung toward Victoria as she desperately tried to maintain control. "These are unfounded allegations. The board is simply trying to modernize." "Then explain these," Linda interrupted, projecting emails onto the screen that had displayed Victoria's presentation. The messages clearly showed the coordination between Victoria, Urban Development Solutions, and various shell companies, laying out their strategy to force residents out. As the evidence mounted and reporters continued filming, Victoria finally lost her composed facade. "This meeting is adjourned," she shouted, gathering her papers. "Anyone who interferes with HOA operations will face severe consequences." But it was too late. The truth was out, captured on camera, and witnessed by dozens of residents. Victoria's carefully constructed scheme was unraveling in real time, broadcast live on local news. As she fled the podium, Mike heard her hiss into her phone, "Initiate Protocol 0. Now." Linda grabbed his arm. "That doesn't sound good. We need to get back to your house immediately." They were about to learn that Victoria had one final, desperate move planned. One that would put not just Mike's garage, but the entire community at risk. Mike and Linda raced back to his house, followed by several other residents who had heard Victoria's ominous command. As they turned onto his street, they saw multiple vehicles parked around his garage, not just the usual HOA security, but teams of workers in Urban Development Solutions uniforms. "What are they doing?" Mike muttered, pulling into his neighbor's driveway since his own was blocked. Through the garage windows, he could see people hastily removing equipment and files. "They're destroying evidence," Linda said, already recording with her phone. "Protocol 0 must be their cleanup operation." Before they could approach, Amanda Porter stepped forward, tablet in hand as usual. "This area is temporarily restricted due to urgent community safety concerns. All residents must maintain a 50-foot distance." "That's my property!" Mike started forward, but Linda held him back. "Wait," she whispered. "Let them keep digging their hole deeper. I've got the police on the way." More residents began gathering, many still arriving from the community center meeting. They watched as Urban Development Solutions workers continued their frantic activity, removing servers and boxes of documents from Mike's garage and other storage facilities throughout the neighborhood. Dr. Williams pushed through the crowd. "They're doing the same thing at my garage, removing all traces of their operation." Tom arrived with unexpected news. "I got into their network before they could shut it down. Been recording their internal communications for the past hour. You won't believe what they're saying." He pulled out his laptop, and they huddled around to listen to the intercepted communications. Victoria's voice came through clearly. "Remove everything, all servers, all documentation. If anyone resists, initiate total lockdown. Better to face trespassing charges than let them prove what we were really doing." Another voice. "Harrison, from Urban Development Solutions. The whole operation's compromised. We need to move to containment mode. Activate all installed systems." Linda was immediately on her phone to Anderson. "James, they're trying to trigger something through the equipment they installed. We need to—" She was cut off by a sudden series of beeps from every garage they'd modified. The electronic locks engaged simultaneously, and metal shutters, installed without residents' knowledge, began descending over the doors and windows. "They're sealing off access," Mike realized. "Trying to lock us out of our own properties while they destroy the evidence." But Victoria had made a crucial mistake. In her rush to implement Protocol Zero, she'd forgotten about Mike's secondary cameras, the ones he'd hidden after discovering their surveillance devices. These cameras were still transmitting to a secure cloud server, recording everything. "Keep recording," Linda called out to the gathered residents. "The more witnesses, the better." Police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Victoria's black SUV appeared at the end of the street, and she emerged looking surprisingly composed despite the chaos. "Mr. Chen," she called out, walking toward him. "One last opportunity to handle this reasonably. Sign the purchase agreement now, and all violations will be forgiven. Continue this resistance, and you'll find yourself facing significant legal consequences." Mike stood his ground. "The only one facing legal consequences will be you, Victoria. We have everything on camera. The forced entries, the planted evidence, the document forgery. It's over." "Is it?" Victoria smiled coldly. "Check your property." "Deed, Mr. Chen. As of this morning, you technically don't own this garage anymore. The board voted to exercise emergency acquisition powers under Section 12 of the updated bylaws." Linda stepped forward. "You mean the bylaws you forged? The ones we've already proven were never legally adopted." "Prove is such a strong word," Victoria replied. "Documents can be challenged. Evidence can disappear. Witnesses can—" She was interrupted by the arrival of multiple police cars and a van-marked county property crimes unit. Anderson emerged from one of the vehicles, accompanied by several officers. "Victoria Blackwood?" one officer called out. "We have a warrant to seize all documents and equipment related to unauthorized property modifications in Highland Meadows." Victoria's composed facade finally cracked. She turned to flee, but found herself surrounded by residents who had positioned themselves to block her escape. As the officers began their work, Linda touched Mike's arm. "This isn't over yet. Victoria and Urban Development Solutions will have contingency plans. We need to secure every piece of evidence before they can destroy it." Mike nodded, watching as the police began dismantling the electronic locks and shutters that had been installed without permission. The garage he'd worked so hard to build and protect had become ground zero in a battle for the entire community's future. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like they were finally fighting back on equal terms. Victoria's desperate attempt to cover her tracks had only exposed the true scope of her operation, and now the whole world was watching. The question was, what would Urban Development Solutions do next, now that their careful plan had been exposed? The police operation continued. Well into the night, officers documented and removed equipment from garages throughout Highland Meadows, while detectives interviewed residents about their experiences with Victoria and the HOA board. Mike watched from his driveway as they dismantled the surveillance network that had been secretly installed in his garage. Around midnight, most of the police activity had wound down, though 2 patrol cars remained stationed in the neighborhood. Linda and Anderson had finally headed home, promising to return first thing in the morning with updates on the legal proceedings. "Try to get some rest," Linda had advised. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." But sleep was the last thing on Mike's mind. He sat in his living room, monitoring his security cameras and reviewing footage from the past few weeks. Sarah had finally fallen asleep on the couch beside him, exhausted from the day's events. At 2:17 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should have taken the offer. Now everything burns." Minutes later, his security system sent an alert. The camera feed showed 3 figures in dark clothing approaching his garage from different directions. They moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the camera locations. Mike gently woke Sarah. "Call the police," he whispered. "We have intruders." Before she could reach her phone, there was a crash from outside. Mike rushed to the window in time to see one of the figures forcing open the side door of his garage. The other 2 stood watch, and in the dim light, he recognized one of them, the security guard who had been with Victoria earlier. Mike's first instinct was to confront them, but he remembered Linda's advice. Document everything. He grabbed his phone and started recording just as the first figure emerged from the garage, carrying what looked like a gas can. "Hey!" Mike shouted through the window. The figures froze, then scattered in different directions. He ran outside, still recording, and saw them jumping into a waiting car, a black sedan, not Victoria's SUV, but similar. The police arrived within minutes, but the intruders were long gone. However, they'd left behind damning evidence. The gas can dropped in their hasty retreat and clear signs of attempted arson. They were going to burn it down, Mike realized, his voice shaking with anger. Destroy the evidence and probably try to blame me for it. The police forensics team arrived to process the scene, and as they worked, Mike received another text from the unknown number. "Next time you won't be so lucky. Think about your family." He showed the messages to the detective in charge, who immediately began the process of tracing them. "This is escalating from property crime to serious criminal threats," she explained. "We're going to need to put surveillance on your house." By dawn, word of the attempted arson had spread through the neighborhood. Residents gathered in small groups, sharing their own stories of late-night intimidation attempts. Dr. Williams reported that someone had tried to break into his home office, while the Hendersons woke to find all their tires slashed. Linda arrived, early, looking grim. "They're desperate now. Urban Development Solutions stock is dropping after last night's news coverage. They're trying to silence everyone before more evidence comes out." "But why go this far?" Sarah asked. "It's just a neighborhood." "Because it's not just about Highland Meadows anymore," Anderson explained, joining them with a stack of fresh documents. "Look what we found when we started digging deeper into Urban Development Solutions records." The documents revealed a massive development plan spanning multiple communities. Highland Meadows was just one piece of a billion-dollar project that would transform the entire region. The company had investors waiting, contracts pending, and political connections expecting returns. "Your resistance here threatens their whole operation," Linda said. "If one community successfully fights back, others might follow. They can't afford to let that happen." Mike's phone buzzed again. Another text. "Last chance, midnight, the HOA office. Come alone or the next fire won't be stopped in time." He showed it to Linda, who immediately started typing on her laptop. "They don't know we've already set up our own surveillance operation. If they're planning something at midnight, we'll be ready." Throughout the day, more residents reported threats and intimidation attempts. But instead of cowering, the community rallied. Neighbors organized watch groups, sharing security camera feeds and patrolling the streets. Every threatening text, every suspicious vehicle, every attempted break-in was documented and reported. As evening approached, Mike prepared for the midnight confrontation. Linda and Anderson had coordinated with the police, setting up an elaborate sting operation. Hidden cameras and microphones were positioned around the HOA office, and undercover officers were stationed nearby. "Remember," Linda advised, "whatever happens, let them make the first move. We need to catch them in the act." What Victoria and her Urban Development Solutions allies didn't realize was that their increasingly desperate tactics had united the community like never before. Their attempt to divide and conquer Highland Meadows had instead created an unbreakable bond between neighbors. As Mike waited for midnight, he knew the real showdown was about to begin, but this time he wasn't fighting alone. At 11:45 p.m., Mike parked his car a block away from the HOA office, just as planned. Linda and Anderson were monitoring from a surveillance van nearby, while undercover officers maintained positions around the building. Through his earpiece, he could hear the police tactical team running final checks. "Remember," Linda's voice came through softly, "we need them to explicitly state their demands. Don't volunteer any information. Let them incriminate themselves." The HOA office sat dark and quiet, its newly painted grey walls looking almost black. In the night, Security cameras installed by Victoria's team blinked steadily, but thanks to Tom's technical skills, they were now feeding into the police surveillance system instead of Urban Development Solutions servers. At precisely midnight, a familiar black SUV pulled into the parking lot, followed by two other vehicles. Victoria emerged from the SUV, along with Harrison and Peters from Urban Development Solutions. They were accompanied by several men Mike recognized from the security team. "Right on schedule," Anderson's voice whispered in Mike's ear. "Everyone in position?" Mike stepped out of the shadows, making sure to stay within view of their hidden cameras. Victoria spotted him immediately, her usual composed smile replaced by something harder. "Mr. Chen," she called out, "I'm glad you decided to be reasonable, though I thought I said to come alone." "I am alone," Mike replied, spreading his arms to show he was by himself. Harrison stepped forward, briefcase in hand. "Let's make this quick. We have papers ready for your immediate property transfer. Sign them now, and all the unfortunate incidents stop. No more threats, no more accidents waiting to happen." "You mean like the attempted arson at my garage?" Mike asked, making sure to get them on record. "Unfortunate incident," Peters cut in smoothly. "Could have been anyone. Lots of angry people in the neighborhood lately. But if you sign tonight, we can guarantee your family's safety." Linda's voice crackled in Mike's ear. "Perfect. Keep them talking about the guarantees." "And what about my neighbors?" Mike asked. "Do they get guarantees too?" Victoria laughed coldly. "Your neighbors will fall in line once they see you cooperate. Everyone has a breaking point, Mr. Chen. We've just had trouble finding yours." "The community storage program," Mike said. "That was never real, was it? Just a way to pressure people into selling?" "A means to an end," Harrison admitted, opening his briefcase. "Now, shall we proceed with the paperwork? The offer expires in 5 minutes, and believe me, you don't want to see what happens next." Mike pretended to consider it, letting the silence stretch. Finally, he asked, "And if I refuse?" Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Then we continue with Protocol 0. Your garage burns. Maybe your house too. Accidents happen all the time in neighborhoods like this. And with the right bribes, police investigations can go nowhere fast." "We have all that," Anderson's voice confirmed in Mike's ear. "Move to Phase 2. Mike smiled for the first time that night. "Thank you for being so specific about your threats, Victoria. I'm sure the FBI agents listening right now really appreciated that last part about bribing police." Victoria's face went pale. Before she could respond, floodlights blazed to life around the parking lot. Police vehicles emerged from hidden positions, and FBI agents in tactical gear surrounded the group. Victoria Blackwood, a federal agent, announced over a loudspeaker, "You and your associates are under arrest for multiple federal crimes, including attempted arson, extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy." Harrison tried to run, but was quickly tackled. Peters immediately raised his hands, already asking for a lawyer. Victoria stood frozen, watching as her carefully constructed scheme collapsed around her. "This isn't over," she hissed at Mike as agents approached with handcuffs. "Urban Development Solutions has resources you can't imagine. We'll bury you in legal fees for years." "Actually," Linda said, emerging from the surveillance van, "I don't think they'll be helping you anymore. While you were here threatening Mike, federal agents were executing search warrants at Urban Development Solutions offices. Seems they're very interested in those political connections you mentioned earlier." As the arrests proceeded, residents began emerging from nearby hiding spots where they'd been watching. Many had their phones out, recording everything. The local news crews Linda had alerted were arriving too, ensuring that Victoria's downfall would be very public. Tom approached with his laptop, grinning. "Got everything recorded and backed up to multiple secure servers. They'll never be able to delete this evidence." Mike watched as Victoria and her conspirators were led away to waiting police vehicles. The nightmare of the past weeks was finally ending, But he knew their fight wasn't completely over. Urban Development Solutions would likely try to distance themselves from Victoria, maybe even attempt to paint her as a rogue agent acting alone. But thanks to the evidence they'd gathered and the community's unified stand, any future attempts to take over Highland Meadows would face prepared and determined resistance. The neighborhood had proven that even the most powerful corporations couldn't simply bully people out of their homes. As the police lights faded into the distance, Mike turned to Linda and Anderson. "What's our next move?" Linda smiled. "Now we make sure this never happens to another community. The evidence we've gathered here is going to help change laws about HOA powers and corporate development tactics." The real victory wasn't just saving his garage or even protecting Highland Meadows. It was exposing a system of corporate bullying that had been operating in the shadows for years. Victoria's arrest was just the beginning. The dawn after Victoria's arrest brought new challenges and revelations. Federal agents had worked through the night, seizing documents and computers from Urban Development Solutions offices. By morning, the scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Mike met Linda and Anderson at their office, where they had set up a command center for organizing evidence. The walls were covered with flowcharts connecting Urban Development Solutions to various shell companies and political figures. "Look at this," Linda said, pointing to a complex diagram. "They've tried this same scheme in 12 other communities. Highland Meadows was just the latest target." Anderson spread out a series of documents on the conference table. These were found in Victoria's office. Detailed plans for what they called community transformation projects, basically a playbook for forcing out residents through HOA manipulation. Mike studied the papers, recognizing tactics that had been used against him. The community storage program, the fake violations, the surveillance, it was all planned months in advance. But they got sloppy here, Tom added, joining them with his laptop. "I've been analyzing the data from their servers. They usually spent 6 to 8 months implementing these takeovers. With Highland Meadows, they tried to do it in weeks." Dr. Williams arrived with more residents who had experienced intimidation. Each person's story added another piece to the puzzle. The Hendersons brought security footage of the tire-slashing incident. Mrs. Rodriguez had recordings of threatening phone calls. Every bit of evidence strengthened their case. "We've got something bigger than just property rights violations," Linda explained. "This is organized criminal activity. RICO violations, wire fraud, conspiracy. The FBI is particularly interested in the political corruption angle." Mike's phone buzzed with a news alert. Urban Development Solutions stock had plummeted as news of the arrests spread. Their CEO had issued a statement distancing the company from Victoria's actions, claiming she was a rogue employee acting without authorization. "They're trying to contain the damage," Anderson observed. "But we can prove the orders came from the top." Victoria kept everything: emails, meeting notes, direct instructions from corporate headquarters. As they worked to organize the evidence, more residents arrived with their stories. The pattern became clear. Victoria had specifically targeted homeowners with larger properties or strategic locations. The garage takeovers were just the first phase of a larger plan to fragment the community. "Here's their full development proposal," Linda said, unrolling a large architectural drawing. "A massive commercial complex, luxury condos, retail space, all built on what used to be our homes. They estimated billions in potential profits." Mike remembered Victoria's words from their confrontation. "Urban Development Solutions has resources you can't imagine." Now those resources were being turned against her. The company's attempts to deny involvement were crumbling as more evidence emerged. Tom had made a breakthrough with the electronic evidence. Their surveillance network was more extensive than we thought. They weren't just watching us, they were collecting personal data, financial information, anything they could use as leverage. The FBI agents assigned to the case were particularly interested in the political connections. Victoria's phone had contained messages to local officials discussing permits that would be expedited once the development plans were revealed. This is why they rushed things, Linda realized. They had deadlines to meet, promises made to investors and politicians. When we started resisting, they couldn't afford to slow down. As the day progressed, they organized the evidence into clear categories: property rights violations, criminal actions, corporate conspiracy, and political corruption. Each category would support different aspects of their legal case. "We're not just fighting for Highland Meadows anymore," Anderson explained. "This evidence could help protect communities across the country from similar schemes." Mike looked at the assembled evidence: photos, videos, documents, recordings, all proving how close they'd come to losing their homes to corporate greed. But they'd done more than just resist. They'd exposed a system of corruption that had operated unchecked for too long. The question now was, how many other communities had fallen victim to these tactics, and could their evidence help them fight back too? Here's part 17, focusing on official support and the granting of the temporary injunction. The federal investigation into urban development solutions moved quickly. Within days of Victoria's arrest, FBI agents had uncovered enough evidence to expand their investigation to the company's national operations. Mike and Sarah sat in a federal courthouse, watching as prosecutors presented their findings to a judge. Linda and Anderson had prepared an exhaustive brief, documenting every illegal action taken against Highland Meadows residents. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor began, "we have evidence of a systematic conspiracy to defraud homeowners through manipulated HOA regulations." She presented Victoria's detailed playbook, showing how the company targeted vulnerable communities. The judge studied the documents carefully, paying particular attention to the surveillance evidence. "This goes beyond simple property rights violations," she noted. "You're describing organized criminal activity." Urban Development Solutions lawyers attempted to distance the company from Victoria's actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails showed direct communication between Victoria and corporate executives, approving every step of the Highland Meadows operation. Furthermore, Linda added, presenting Tom's technical analysis, their surveillance network violated multiple federal privacy laws. They collected personal data without consent, using it to target specific homeowners for harassment. The judge's expression darkened as she reviewed the evidence of political corruption. "The scope of this conspiracy is disturbing. Mr. Chen's garage was just the beginning of a much larger scheme." After several hours of testimony, the judge made her ruling. "I'm granting an immediate injunction against Urban Development Solutions and all affiliated entities. They are barred from any further contact with Highland Meadows residents or property." But she wasn't finished. "Additionally, I'm ordering a freeze on all Urban Development Solutions development projects nationwide, pending a full federal investigation. This company's tactics pose a serious threat to communities across the country." The corporate lawyers immediately protested, citing potential financial losses, but the judge was unmoved. "Your clients should have considered those losses before engaging in organized criminal activity." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as Linda explained the significance of the ruling. "This injunction doesn't just protect Highland Meadows. It sets a precedent for fighting corporate development schemes that abuse HOA regulations." Mike's phone started buzzing with messages from other communities sharing similar stories. Urban Development Solutions had attempted their tactics elsewhere, but now people had a blueprint for fighting back. The FBI investigation expanded to include local officials who had facilitated the scheme. Several building inspectors and zoning officials were placed on administrative leave pending investigation of bribery allegations. "We've opened a door," Anderson explained to the gathered residents. "Other communities can use our evidence to fight similar corporate takeover attempts." This ruling shows that homeowners have legal recourse against these predatory practices. Sarah squeezed Mike's hand as they watched Urban Development Solutions executives being served with federal subpoenas. "All this started because you wouldn't let them take your garage," she said softly, but Mike knew it was more than that. The garage had simply been the first visible sign of a larger threat to their community. By standing firm, they'd exposed a network of corruption that had operated unchecked for years. The temporary injunction was just the beginning. In the coming weeks, more evidence would emerge as federal investigators dug deeper into Urban Development Solutions operations. The company's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, revealing the true cost of their community transformation projects. For the residents of Highland Meadows, the injunction meant they could finally reclaim their properties without fear of corporate retaliation. But they also recognized their responsibility to help other communities fight similar battles. As they left the courthouse, Linda was already organizing meetings with residents from other targeted neighborhoods. The evidence they'd gathered would become a roadmap for protecting communities from corporate exploitation. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time, they had the law firmly on their side. The impact of the federal injunction was immediate and far-reaching. Within days of the ruling, Urban Development Solutions began dismantling their operations in Highland Meadows. Workers arrived to remove the unauthorized equipment from residents' garages, restoring them to their original condition. Mike watched from his driveway as they removed the electronic locks and surveillance systems from his garage. The workers were different now, subdued and supervised by federal agents who documented every step of the removal process. Tom monitored the dismantling of their network infrastructure, ensuring no surveillance devices remained hidden. "They're actually doing a thorough job," he reported, "probably because the FBI is watching their every move." The company's stock continued to plummet as more communities came forward with similar stories. Major investors began distancing themselves, and several board members resigned. The carefully constructed corporate empire was crumbling. Local news crews documented the removal of the community storage signs and equipment. Dr. Williams gave interviews about his experience, becoming a spokesperson for homeowners fighting corporate development schemes. Victoria and her associates remained in custody, denied bail due to the extent of their crimes and potential flight risk. The evidence against them grew stronger as more witnesses came forward, including former Urban Development Solutions employees willing to testify about the company's practices. Linda coordinated with FBI agents as they traced the money trail, uncovering a complex web of bribes and kickbacks. "They spent millions setting up these operations," she explained. "The potential profits must have been enormous for them to risk so much." The HOA office was now under federal control, its records being carefully examined for evidence of other schemes. The fraudulent bylaws were officially invalidated, and plans were made for new board elections with strict oversight. Mike's garage, the catalyst for exposing the conspiracy, became a symbol of community resistance. Other neighborhoods facing similar threats sought advice on protecting their properties from corporate takeovers. Anderson worked to create a legal framework for preventing future abuse of HOA regulations. "What happened here exposed a dangerous loophole in property rights laws," he explained. "We need to ensure this can't happen again." Sarah organized community meetings to help residents process what had happened and plan for the future. The trauma of nearly losing their homes had brought neighbors closer together, strengthening their commitment to protecting their community. As the last of the unauthorized equipment was removed, Mike finally had his garage back. The space that had become ground zero in their fight against corporate greed could return to being what it was meant to be, a place for his hobbies and projects. The victory felt significant, but incomplete. They had stopped one company's predatory practices, but how many others were out there, targeting other communities. The evidence they'd gathered would help others fight back, but the larger battle for property rights was just beginning. Urban Development Solutions' retreat from Highland Meadows marked the end of one chapter, but everyone knew this was just the beginning of a longer story. The community had learned valuable lessons about vigilance, unity, and the importance of standing together against corporate overreach. The question now was, how would they use their experience to help protect other communities from similar threats? Mike spent the next week restoring his garage to its former state. The illegal modifications had left marks on the walls and floors, but he was determined to erase every trace of Urban Development Solutions' intrusion. As he worked, other residents stopped by to share their own recovery stories. The Hendersons were finally able to park their cars in their garage again. Dr. Williams had reclaimed his space and was reorganizing his medical supplies properly. Throughout Highland Meadows, people were taking back control of their properties. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. A national news program featured Highland Meadows in a special report about corporate development tactics. Mike's story, the garage that sparked a federal investigation, became a centerpiece of their coverage. Local businesses that had been pressured to stay quiet began speaking out. The hardware store owner revealed how Urban Development Solutions had threatened his lease when he tried to warn residents. The real estate office admitted to being coerced into promoting the company's purchase offers. Linda helped establish a property rights advocacy group using Highland Meadows' experience as a template for protecting other communities. "We need to share what we learned," she explained. The next neighborhood they target might not be as fortunate in exposing their schemes early. The federal investigation expanded to other states where Urban Development Solutions had operated. Similar patterns emerged: HOA infiltration, fraudulent bylaws, surveillance, and intimidation. Highland Meadows' evidence provided investigators with a blueprint for identifying these schemes. Mike's garage business began to recover. Clients who had been scared away by the HOA's interference returned, impressed by his stand against corporate bullying. His YouTube channel gained followers interested in both his restoration work and his story of resistance. Anderson worked with state legislators to draft new laws protecting homeowners from predatory development practices. What happened here exposed dangerous gaps in property rights protection. He testified at a legislative hearing. "We need stronger safeguards against corporate abuse of HOA regulations." The community itself was transformed. Neighbors who had barely known each other before the crisis now worked together to rebuild their HOA from the ground up. New bylaws were written with extensive resident input and strict limits on board powers. Sarah organized a community celebration marking their victory. In the space where Victoria had once threatened residents with fines and forced sales, families gathered to share stories and strengthen their bonds. Tom's technical expertise proved invaluable in setting up legitimate security systems to prevent future infiltration attempts. "We learned the hard way about digital vulnerabilities," he said, while installing new safeguards. "But we also learned how to protect ourselves." As normalcy returned to Highland Meadows, residents remained vigilant. The experience had taught them the importance of staying involved in community governance and questioning any attempts to infringe on property rights. Mike's garage, once a target of corporate greed, became a symbol of successful resistance. Other communities facing similar threats sought advice on protecting their properties. The lessons learned in Highland Meadows were being shared across the country. The recovery wasn't just about restoring physical spaces. It was about rebuilding trust and strengthening community bonds. The crisis had shown them the power of unity in the face of corporate overreach. As Mike put the finishing touches on his restored garage, he reflected on how a simple fight to protect his property had evolved into something much larger. They hadn't just saved their homes, They'd exposed a systemic threat to communities everywhere. The garage was his again, but its significance had changed. It now stood as a reminder that ordinary people, standing together, could successfully fight back against corporate exploitation. The transformation of Highland Meadows continued as summer turned to fall. What began as one man's fight to protect his garage had evolved into a model for community activism and resistance against corporate overreach. Weekly community meetings, once sparsely attended, now filled the community center. Residents shared updates on the ongoing federal investigation and discussed strategies for preventing future takeover attempts. The sense of unity that emerged during their struggle against urban development solutions had grown stronger. Local media continued covering Highland Meadows' story, but from a different angle. Instead of reporting on corporate corruption, they focused on how the community had rebuilt itself. The new HOA board, democratically elected and transparent, became an example for other neighborhoods. Other communities facing similar threats began sending representatives to learn from Highland Meadows' experience. Mike and Dr. Williams frequently hosted workshops, sharing their strategies for recognizing and resisting corporate infiltration attempts. Linda's property rights advocacy group expanded, establishing chapters in communities across the state. They created a network for sharing information about suspicious development activities and coordinating legal responses. The federal investigation's findings led to broader reforms. State legislators, using Highland Meadows as a case study, passed new laws strengthening homeowner protections and limiting corporate influence over HOAs. Anderson's legal framework became a model for similar legislation nationwide. Mike's garage, once a battleground, became a gathering place for neighbors. He organized weekly car maintenance workshops, teaching residents basic skills while building community bonds. The space that Victoria had tried to steal now served as a symbol of community empowerment. Tom established a technology committee, training residents to recognize and report suspicious surveillance attempts. His network security protocols were adopted by other communities seeking to protect themselves from corporate intrusion. The Hendersons, who had initially given in to Victoria's pressure, became vocal advocates for homeowner rights. Their experience helped other residents understand the importance of standing together against intimidation. Support came from unexpected places. Local businesses, freed from urban development solutions influence, actively participated in community events. The hardware store sponsored tool-sharing programs, while the real estate office helped expose similar schemes in nearby neighborhoods. Sarah coordinated with other communities to create a mutual support network. When another neighborhood reported suspicious HOA activities, Highland Meadows residents shared their expertise and resources to help investigate. The sense of community extended beyond property rights issues. Neighbors who had come together to fight corporate takeover now collaborated on various initiatives to improve their neighborhood. Garden clubs, youth programs, and senior support services flourished. As their story spread, Highland Meadows residents received letters from across the country. Other communities shared their own experiences with corporate development schemes, seeking advice and offering solidarity. The legacy of their resistance went beyond preventing one company's takeover attempt. They had created a blueprint for community empowerment, showing how ordinary people could successfully stand up to corporate interests. Mike often reflected on how different things might have been if he had given in to Victoria's initial pressure. His decision to fight for his garage had sparked a movement that transformed not just Highland Meadows, but potentially communities nationwide. The support network they built proved that the strongest defense against corporate overreach wasn't legal strategies or security systems. It was the bonds between neighbors who refused to let their community be destroyed for profit. 20 like most mornings now, Mike was up early, working in his garage. The fresh epoxy floor gleamed under the LED lights, and his tools hung perfectly, arranged on the pegboard walls. But something was different today, a sense of earned pride that went beyond just having a well-organized workspace. A year had passed since Victoria's arrest, and the changes in Highland Meadows were profound. The federal investigation had led to multiple convictions, with Victoria and her Urban Development Solutions colleagues facing significant prison time for fraud, corruption, and racketeering. Mike paused his work on the Mustang to review the latest. Email from Linda. The property rights advocacy group they'd established had successfully helped 3 other communities resist similar corporate takeover attempts. Their model of community resistance was working. The garage that had been at the center of it all had become more than just his personal workshop. It now hosted monthly community meetings where residents from other neighborhoods came to learn about protecting their properties. The space that Victoria had tried to steal had become a symbol of successful resistance. Dr. Williams stopped by, as he often did these days. "You know," he said, settling into one of the shop chairs, "I was talking to the FBI agent handling our case. They're using Highland Meadows as a case study for training their financial crimes unit." Mike nodded, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Hard to believe it all started with that first notice on my garage door." "You could have given in," Dr. Williams reminded him. "Most people would have." But Mike had discovered something about himself, and during the fight, a strength he didn't know he had. Standing up to Victoria and Urban Development Solutions had shown him that one person's resistance could spark a movement. The skills they'd developed during their struggle were being put to good use. Tom's security protocols were being adopted by HOAs nationwide. Anderson's legal frameworks were helping shape new property protection laws. Sarah's community organizing techniques were being taught to other neighborhoods facing similar threats. Mike's YouTube channel had evolved too. Alongside his car restoration videos, he now included content about community activism and property rights. The comment section was filled with stories from other homeowners fighting their own battles against corporate overreach. The personal growth wasn't just about fighting corporate bullies. Mike had learned valuable lessons about leadership, community, building, and the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. His garage, once just a place for his hobbies, had become a testament to the power of principled resistance. That evening, as residents gathered for their weekly community meeting, Mike looked around at the faces of his neighbors. They weren't just people who lived near each other anymore. They were allies who had fought together and won. The bond they'd formed during their struggle had created something stronger than any HOA bylaw or corporate scheme could break. As he shared their story with yet another group of concerned homeowners from a nearby community, Mike realized that their victory wasn't just about saving properties. It was about discovering the strength that comes from standing together against injustice. The garage that Victoria had tried to seize was now a symbol of that strength. A reminder that when ordinary people refuse to back down, even the most powerful corporations can be defeated. Personal victory, Mike had learned, wasn't just about winning the immediate fight. It was about growing into someone capable of helping others win their battles too. 2 years after Victoria's arrest, Mike hosted a community barbecue in his driveway. His restored garage, gleaming in the afternoon sun, stood as a testament to their victory. The gathering wasn't just a celebration, it was a strategy session for the future. Representatives from 12 different communities had come to learn from Highland Meadows' experience. The property rights network they'd built now spanned 3 states, with Linda coordinating legal resources and Tom providing technical support. "It's not just about stopping one company," Mike explained to the gathered crowd. "It's about preventing these tactics from working anywhere." He gestured to his garage, where maps and documents outlined known corporate development schemes across the country. The federal investigation had expanded beyond urban development solutions, exposing similar operations by other companies. Highland Meadows' evidence had helped prosecutors build cases against multiple corporate entities attempting to exploit HOA regulations for profit. Anderson arrived with news from the state capitol. The Property Rights Protection Act passed, he announced. The new law specifically addresses the tactics used against us. No more fraudulent HOA takeovers, no more forced community storage schemes. Dr. Williams, who had become a respected advocate for homeowner rights, shared updates on their preventive measures. We've identified 3 attempts to infiltrate HOAs in neighboring counties. Each one was stopped before they could implement their plans. The garage that Victoria had tried to claim now served as both workshop and community center. Weekly meetings helped residents stay vigilant, while educational programs taught other communities how to protect themselves. Mike's YouTube channel had evolved into a resource for property rights advocacy, reaching hundreds of thousands of viewers. The comment section was filled with success stories from communities that had used Highland Meadows strategies to fight their own battles. Sarah coordinated with national housing rights organizations, sharing their experience to help shape policy recommendations. Their story had become a case study in effective community resistance against corporate overreach. As evening approached, Mike stood in his garage doorway, watching children play in the driveways while adults discussed community initiatives. The space that had once been threatened was now stronger than ever, protected not just by new laws, but by an engaged and united community. "Ready for the next fight?" Linda asked, joining him. Mike nodded, knowing that their work wasn't over. Corporate developers would find new tactics, but Highland Meadows would be ready. They had built something stronger than any HOA regulation or corporate scheme. A community that understood its power and wasn't afraid to use it. The garage lights illuminated the gathering as the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood that had refused to be erased. In the end, Victoria's attempt to seize control had achieved the opposite of her intentions. Instead of fragmenting the community, she had united it. Instead of demonstrating corporate power, she had revealed its limitations. Mike's fight for his garage had become something larger, a blueprint for community resistance that would continue to inspire and guide others for years to come. The real victory wasn't just in saving their properties, it was in discovering their collective strength and learning how to use it. As the gathering continued into the evening, Mike knew that Highland Meadows was more than just ready for future challenges. They were eager to help other communities face them too. The garage that had started it all remained a symbol of what ordinary people could achieve when they stood together against corporate greed. It was never just about a garage. It was about drawing a line and saying, "This is where we make our stand. This is where we fight back. This is where we win," and they had. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.